Alrighty, so people seem to really enjoy the previous Discord Q&A video, and I have a lot of new people on the Discord, a lot of new questions, and so here's number two. We're going to be going through a lot of questions today, and yeah, let's just get into it. So starting out with, why do some items track damage dealt and some others don't? This is a longer post, and you'll notice this with a number of them. I kind of truncated it because I felt like answering the question, mostly was in the spirit of like the first sentence or two, but. This is kind of a more complicated question than I think people might expect. The actual answer here is that uh, trackers aren't really standardized, right? We don't have an internal rule that says items that do this get trackers and items that do these things don't get trackers, right? The actual reality is that back in 2023, this is for the 2024 season, there was a big push from some designers internally for cutting down on some trackers and removing some trackers, which you could see at the beginning of the season, and then those got put back because there was some player sentiment that was pretty negative around that. But there was a lot of push to remove and cut down on the number of trackers for a specific reason. And the reason is that there are some trackers that actually end up being really detrimental to the way that players perceive items and understand items. Now, here's an example I'm going to use. I think this is the best example. It doesn't necessarily hold up today, right? Like the items have changed, but this is a real problem back in like 2022, 2023, when Blade of the Ruined King was being compared to other on-hit items. And back then, Blade of the Ruined King had a huge amount of power in its actual on-hit effect, right? One of the things that's important to understand here is that items are not distributed, like items do not have their power distributed evenly between their stats and their unique passives, right? Some items have almost all their power in their stats and very little power in their unique passives. So others are the reverse, where they have a lot of power in the unique passives and very little power in their stats, right? And so the problem we ran into was when we had this tracker on Blade of the Ruined King, players, especially like regular average players, would compare Blade of the Ruined King's damage to other on-hit items, and they say, "Oh, Blade of the Ruined King is always doing way more damage than all of my other on-hit items, no matter when I build them in my build, no matter what champion I'm playing. Blade of the Ruined King is always doing the most damage. Therefore." Blade of the Ruined King must be the best item. It must be the best item in the game. Every single time I compare it to something else, it just has a much higher number. And the actual reality was like, well, we don't track the damage dealt by, say, like at the time, the AD on Wit's End or the AD and AS on Kraken Slayer or whatever, right? And the truth was that actually Blade of the Ruined King at that time was one of the weaker items in the game. But player perception, and this actually showed up a lot in our surveys, right? We repeatedly got surveys where players would say, like, Blade of the Ruined King needs to be nerfed, or Blade of the Ruined King, we'd ask them to stack rank, like, what do you think are the strongest items in the game? And they would, often say Blade of the Ruined King was the strongest item in the game, even though factually, Blade of the Ruined King was actually one of the weaker items, because the tracker kept reporting it as really, really, really high amounts of damage. Because that was most of the item's output and the stats were very poor at that time, that warped player perception. And so this led to a lot of designers internally saying, hey, actually, there are some trackers that we probably shouldn't do on our items. And we should focus on trackers like Grievous Wounds, because Grievous Wounds, I think, is an example of a tracker that players actually use really effectively, right? Even average players that have little to no understanding of how items sort of work under the hood. The way that people use Grievous Wounds naturally, the tracker on it, is you look at your you buy a thorn a thorn mail or an oblivion orb or an executioner's collar, whatever, and you take a look at the tooltip. Hey, I just fought with an Aatrox. How much healing did I reduce? Or hey, I bought an executioner's early in lane as Senna against Soraka, Samira, or whatever, and then we 2v2 killed them. How much healing did I reduce? Right, and then you actually compare that to how the Grievous Wounds items performed in other games that you played. Right, you don't look at it and compare your Executioner's Calling to your Liandry's, right? That's not how most players naturally use the Grievous Wounds trackers. And that's really how these trackers should be used, right? Because comparing the trackers with other items in your same build, especially in different slots, isn't actually a useful way of comparing them, and in fact, again, leads players down conclusions that can be dangerous and warping to perception. Uh, so ultimately, I think I look at the trackers, and I think most other designers look at the trackers and say like, hey, some of these trackers, the ones that players use to players use to compare uh, items to themselves across games, that is how the trackers should be used. And the ones that players naturally use that way, those are awesome trackers, and they should be like those are literally just good to have forever, right? Like we should always have those. Conversely, the trackers that are often used to compare items to each other, or like to other items that go like that occupy a similar space, or are competitive with those items on certain champions, those can be dangerous. Now, we have a lot of those trackers still in the game, right? As an example, Blue the Rune King still has a tracker, right? Um, and there are dangers associated with that, but I think we've gotten the item system into a point where we don't have any cases of those in the current system where it's like on fire because players are perceiving an item to be significantly more or less powerful than it actually is. And that I think is desirable, right? That we don't have player perception that is super far off. And ultimately, like, we do want the items to be factually balanced, but we also want players to perceive the items as balanced, right? We don't want players to believe incorrectly that one of these items, which is actually, in reality weak, is, oh, players believe that it's the best item in the game, right? Like we don't want there to be these massive perception mismatches. It's totally okay if there are smaller ones, and that's something like that's a point of mastery that players can learn. But we don't really, want to set our players up to fail, essentially, to like give them information that might be extremely misleading, especially for the average player. Now, one thing I'll note here is like maybe what we could or should do is actually by default we only show you, grievous wounds trackers and maybe a couple of others that we think are really good for typical players to see, and then there's a setting somewhere in the options that would show you more information, or whatever, right? Something that we wouldn't expect most players to use. No, side note here, by the way, is like most players don't even use any alternative settings in the options. And so like, hey, there is a difference here, a lot, like especially for people in my Discord, right? Like people in my Discord are much more likely to be like hard optimizers that are much more interested and much more inclined to use these types of trackers in ways that are, that make sense, and are, correct and not super perception warping. And so it could be that, hey, maybe we should have an option for players to opt into advanced information that might not be good for the average player, that might be perception warping for the average player, but that, hey, you can see this if you opt in, is a probably better way of putting things. And I'm not saying we for sure should do that or not. Like I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, but that's the kind of thing that I think could be good in this space where it's like, hey, we have a, this could give us a way to get this information to hyper optimize players that actually are really interested in this type of information, but not pollute the average player's perception with information that, is not good for them, or gives that like leads them to very, wrong conclusions about power levels or structure of the item system. um Ultimately, I will say, like, I myself am pretty permissive on the trackers, right? As an example, when I made the feet boots, the defensive boots, Armored Advanced and Chainlace Crushers, the upgrades for Tabbies and Mercs, they actually have trackers on them, because when we were testing them, the game analysis team asked me, hey, we can do, math and static analysis on how much shielding these could theoretically give you in combat, but we want to know how much they actually are shielding. And so they asked me to put trackers in for development purposes. I put them in, and then I just never took them out, right? Because I was like, well, I already made these. We might as well just leave them in. Um, I will say this is a very minor point. Like, don't take this as, oh, this is this is the main reason. It's a very, very minor point. It's like a very edge case thing. There were a couple of cases where some of the trackers were actually causing server performance issues in really, really extreme cases. The Riftmaker one, I think, was the big one where the layer of the engine where we have access to tooltips and we can do tracker stuff is not the same layer of the engine where damage calculations are done. And so we essentially have to redo all the damage calculations for something like Riftmaker's damage amp, in order to show it in a tracker. And it's not that efficient. And so there were some issues with like, if you go back in time to Mythic Riftmaker time, there were situations where like if you bought Riftmaker, the old version of Shadow Flame, and like Serpent's Fang, and you applied a lot of damage instances very quickly, because all of the trackers on those items would have to check each other's math, and then check each other's trackers, and then they would do this not like infinitely recursively, but they would, this would create a lot of sequences of operations that would do a lot of things on the same server frames. This could actually cause server hitches when you would like people would do this on Gwen where they'd like R3 through a couple of people, and that would cause a lot of damage instances very quickly, and the server would be like, I gotta do all this math really quickly, like on all these damage instances, and I need to update all these trackers instantly. There are ways we can get around this, but it's just a lot of math, and so like stuff like Riftmaker, the current way that we do trackers, which like in fairness, like we probably should redo it, to be honest. We probably should redo it from where we have currently, because it's not the most computationally efficient. And the actual act of calling, hey, you might notice this if you pay a lot of attention to trackers. Some trackers only update like every 2 seconds or every 3 seconds, every 5 seconds. That is because the actual act of that script layer reaching out upwards to contact the layer that can do tooltips is actually pretty computational, like pretty expensive on the server side, because it has to send a communication to every client, or to every client, and so there's some like server cost, like server optimization stuff that's associated with this, that has been a minor issue in the past, when in combination with large numbers of these. Another thing I will also note is that not all of our trackers are particularly accurate. As an example, one of the ones that I've seen people mention a couple of times is like, oh, the cleaver tracker was nice for the armor shred. The cleaver armor shred tracker that we had in briefly was wildly inaccurate. It's one of the least accurate trackers we've had in the game ever, and most of them, to be honest with you, are only correct within a like a margin of error. They're not really made to be super robust. Like some of them are like literally perfect and can never be wrong because they have like self-correcting and stuff like that. But a lot of them honestly are accurate within it, like within certain margins of error. Like the Sterax one, for example, if you've ever paid attention to the Sterax one and you've like calculated like how much damage did this actually block, you might realize like actually the Sterax tracker is often off by like 100 or 200 health, upwards or downwards, because it has issues that can cause it to go up or down. One of the issues I remember off the top of my head from last time I looked at it was like if you gain any maximum health, it tracks how much the shield could have shielded at the beginning of the effect. But if your maximum health changes, it recalculates the shield value, and so it thinks the shield was a different size than it was, for example, right? Like that's just like an efficiency thing. Anyway, point I'm getting at is that I will warn you, like not all the trackers are actually like super hyper accurate. And again, that's that's just how they're currently set up, and like if we really wanted super good, super accurate trackers, we would probably need to redo like exactly how do they work under the hood, because currently they're kind of subject to ordering issues and like access to limited information because the way that we set them up isn't perfect. Uh, so to sort of sum up this, uh, the reason why we don't have a tracker on literally everything is mainly that some of these trackers can actually cause perception issues where players don't use the information provided in a particularly good way for the way that the item system is actually structured. Uh, some of them I think are actually very good for that, right? Again, I use Grievous Wounds as an example. But that was what caused the push to have certain trackers like either removed or limited in how much information they were providing, and so on and so forth, back in the past. I think in the current day, right, like I'm the main person who's working on the item system today, so, and again, I would say I'm particularly permissive and I don't really mind the trackers as long as they're not causing like a Blade of the Ruined King level perception problem like we had in the past years ago. So I personally don't mind it, right? You can see that I have a number of trackers on some of the new items that I made, and I wouldn't even really mind making some new ones. I've actually considered making like a tracker for Actualizer, for example. I just haven't built that out yet. But yeah, overall, we probably could have some more trackers, but we don't have like a universal policy of this is what should or shouldn't have a tracker. So a lot of the time, it's just up to the individual designer working on the item whether they want to make one or not. So that's kind of where we ended up. All right, what crit item slot is Hex Optics C44 supposed to fit in? So this is an interesting question. I'm not going to go into the full story of this, but you can go back and watch my item video and go to the section about C44, you can listen to that and hear the story of this item. But basically, originally I made this item as a later slot, as both a later slot competitor, like, hey, maybe sometimes you'll want this over LDR or Infinity Edge. And maybe in some games when you do like Yuntal first, or you're a champion that doesn't need attack speed, you would do this as your fourth item if you go like first item, Infinity Edge, LDR, and then this could be your fourth item if you just want more AD. That was the original idea of the item. As we tested it more, though, um, people playing it in tests often said, like, actually, I would love to buy this second item sometimes. And we also realized, hey, we're probably not getting people to, AD carries to move off of LDR, but we could get them to move off of Infinity Edge in some games, right? Like, because we'd raised the base crit multiplier and, Infinity Edge had less crit multiplier on it, it became less relatively important for your total DPS to actually get that Infinity Edge going. And so I made the item cheaper and shifted it a little forward in build paths. And so I think currently I'm actually pretty happy with it being a second item for a few champions. And, there's buffs coming for the item in the next patch, which we'll see how that plays out. But I actually wouldn't personally be offended if it ended up being a good first item for a couple champions, right? Like, as an example, if Caitlyn were buying C44 first, I'd be like, yeah, you know what? That kind of makes some sense, right? Like, I could see that being good some games. Obviously, it does have a passive that is like, more tailored towards like team fighting, right? The range on takedown is obviously like pretty nice for later parts of the game, but and the percent increased for range is like also, as a scaling passive, it's literally percent increased damage, right? It's a multiplier. And so that part is kind of interesting from the perspective of like, hey, if we really wanted to push it into first item slot, I would probably make at least one of those more tailored to the early game. Like, as an example, imagine a world where I change the percent increased damage. Instead of that, I say like, hey, your attacks deal extra flat damage based on how far away they are. And it's like up to 40 flat damage or whatever. I don't know what the right number would be. I'd have to think about that more. But if it ends up that C44 doesn't have a cool place in builds, and we actually think it should be a first item, which is something that a lot of people I think are kind of interested in it, that's the kind of thing I would think about. Is like, hey, actually, maybe should the range damage be flat to move it forwards in builds and make it a better first and second item. But we'll see what happens where it ends up with the buffs, because I think that it's currently factually pretty good on Jinx and Caitlyn in the second and third slot, and even fourth in some games. So we'll see how it does with buffs. Yeah, the original intent was that it was going to be later in builds, but after testing it, a lot of the feedback from testing was like, I want to build this earlier, and so most of it shifting it forwards in builds is just me responding to feedback from internal testing, and then also testing for players on live as well. Can we have heal and shield power be accounted for on spell and item tooltips? This is something that we know people would love to have. It's something that we would love to do. The question is just always, how much work is it, and what could be done with that time that we would not be doing if we did this. This is something that's been an engineering backlog task for years at this point. It's something that it gets talked about probably every 6 months or so as, should we bring this in? Should we do this? I would expect it to happen at some point. It's something that, like, actually I recently had a conversation about, like, hey, when when could we do it this year? Is this year a good year to do it? Right? It's a lot of engineering work because we have to have our tooltips, essentially our spell calculations that go into tooltips. We need to have a way of tagging them. Hey, this is a heal and a shield, and then we need to essentially pipe in the information there of like, this is how much heal and shield power you have into the correct areas, such that your client can do this calculation for you. Heal and shield power currently is like halfway between being a real stat and a fake stat. It's like got part of the properties of being a real stat and some of the properties of being a fake stat. When I say real versus fake stat, it's that I'm referring to like basically parts of the engine and like how they understand what statistics you have. There's work to be done here if we want to do this. I personally think we should do it at some point. I also think like damage amp, for example, should be made into a stat, and then we should also have that factor into your tooltips. That's another similar project that similarly has like a backlog task that would need to be pulled into an to an engineer's actual workload. So the summary of the answer here is, I would love to do this. I think it would be awesome, but engineering time is always limited, and it's just a question of like, what else could the engineer be doing, and do we think this is the most valuable thing for them to be doing at any given time? All right. Is there room for design room for new summoner spells like a defensive, self-empowering top lane tank spell? So they gave an example of like what they would want to hear. Um, I've talked about this on stream a number of times. I think that summoner spell design space is really, really, really difficult because like ostensibly you have 2 slots, but really you only have 1 slot like 99% of the time, right? Because Flash, of course, is going to take a slot, and I won't get into the details here, but it's like I think generally Flash is good for the game, and it's good for the game that the Flash is very powerful and very multi-purpose and very flexible. You know, it's super flexible, it's super powerful, it's super high cooldown. Flash's properties, I think, are actually really good for the game, and I wouldn't really be as super supportive of like some of the projects that I've, some of the ideas that I've heard, like, oh, you could split Flash into 2 summoners, or you could modify Flash in these ways to make it less necessary. And it's like, I don't actually think that's good, right? I think it's actually good that Flash. So you really have 1 slot to work with. Now, I do think with the advent of the top lane quest, it is more interesting thinking about things like, hey, what summoners could be good for top laners that aren't teleport, right? Because in the past, it was kind of hard to argue. Is like, well, top laners, they take a combat summoner, which is really good for them, or they take teleport, and that's kind of the end of it. And then it's like summoner, junglers have smite, and then mid laners is like kind of similar to top lane, but with maybe with a little more flexibility. And then there's some defensive summoners for bot lane, and maybe some offensive summoners. It's like, okay, but if you only have 1 slot, you kind of have to target taking some of the space away from something that currently exists, right? With the idea of a self-empowering defensive summoner as an example, it's like, okay, so you're trying to take the space of teleport, or maybe like barrier, but like obviously that's not very good for top laners. So it's like, okay, maybe there's some space there, right? I think that there is potentially some space for new summoners, for what it's worth, right? We've had some projects in the past where we experimented with things like this, um, but I think my opinion on this is that we're much more likely to get uh, movement in summoner spells by uh, subdividing or breaking up like existing spells, or potentially merge, like messing more with the existing spells than coming in with a brand new concept. Like as an example, heal and barrier are similar, right? What, like, we could take a look at these and say, like, how do we either differentiate these more, or maybe combine them into one summoner that's a little more interesting, and that maybe opens up some space for a different defensive summoner that could be cool. Maybe something like this here that's suggested, like a self-empowerment defensive. What about something like Surge? We don't really have a combat buff that makes you stronger over a long period of time, right? We have Ghost, which makes you faster, right? But we don't have something that makes you actually better at fighting people over a longer period, right? I think there is space here, but I also think it's an extremely difficult space. I will say that summoner spells, I think, are one of the most difficult systems to work on, as evidenced by the fact that we haven't really changed them that much over the years. It's just a very, very, very tough space, because you have to think about every single champion, just like items, except there's no opportunity cost, right? You can't give these things stats exactly, right? Whereas like items, as an example, it's like, well, you know, there might be some problems with an item like Dusk and Dawn, for example, if it had AD on it, right? I didn't have to consider that really at all because I made it an AP item, right? And so I got to narrow my focus on making a new item because of the statistics that it had. Summoners don't have that, right? And so the design space is very like loose. I don't know what, there's probably better terminology for that, but the design space is very open. Or the optimization space is very open, so it becomes very difficult to do design work here. And you're also competing with very powerful effects that have been in the game for 16 plus years, right? And so anything new, powerful that you make is likely to be really shocking. Anything that actually competes with existing summoners is likely to be really, really eye-popping, shocking, and potentially hard to get players to accept, right? As an example, it's like, imagine we tried to make an item like Zhonya's today. Imagine Zhonya's didn't exist and we tried to make it. It's like, people would be extremely offended, I think, by something like that, right? Imagine we tried to make like Karthus today, right? People would be so offended by Karthus passive, right? But it's part of the game. It's always been part of the game, and so people get used to it, and that's very different than making something new. It could be very hard to make things that are new in the summoner spell space that players would accept, especially in the short term. And so I think this is a very tough design space, but to answer the actual, like the literal questions, like, is there design room for new summoner spells? Yes, I think there probably is, but it's very, very, very hard. All right. Is there a reason why tank supports don't get a lot of dedicated magic resistance items? Yes, there's a couple reasons. I would say the main one is that we know for a fact that there's very little um, opportunity. Like there's very little opportunity space here because it's very infrequent you would actually want to buy a dedicated support magic resistance item, right? Great example of this is like look at the tank support itemization over the years and see how the items that aren't extremely generic, right? This is things like Trailblazer today, right? As a good example, like Knight's Vow, today and in the past, right? The items that have tailored resistances that don't have dual resistances or pure health, right? Like pure health examples from the past would be things like, the movement speed warmogs from 2024 that I made, right? As an example, that was actually a really good rush for supports, right? But the items that have tailored resistances, specifically armor, are already way less purchased than more generic options because tank support itemization is very different from income tank itemization, right? Tanks that actually have a source of gold. Number one is they're expected to be functional on fewer items, and that means that it's harder for you to tailor your itemization to the enemy like compositions. But actually, I think more importantly, you don't have as much choice over who you're fighting, right? As like a top lane Cho'Gath or something like that, right? It's like you buy, say you're laning against magic damage, you're laning against, Gwen or something, and the rest of the enemy comp is all AD. Okay, you buy a Hollow Radiance, and maybe you feel good about that in lane, and you're like, okay, I need to start buying armor because I'm gonna have to start interacting with the rest of the enemy team now, right? I'm gonna start team fighting. Um, Tank supports don't really get that luxury. It's a little improved in the current season because they're getting a little bit more gold. But the reality is, like, as a tank support, you don't get to choose, hey, I only want to interact with the enemy double mage bot lane or whatever, right? I want my MR item and I'm going to interact only with them. It's like, well, no, that's not how playing support works most of the time, right? Actually, you need to go ward. You're going to have to go place this ward on top side because Rift Herald is spawning, and surprise, surprise, you ran into the enemy Lee Sin while you were warding. Like you only had MR, you died instantly, right? Like you don't get to choose you don't get to have as much agency over who you're interacting with as a tank support, which means that tailoring your resistances to the enemies that you're more likely to interact with is not as useful as it is for income tanks. Now, all of this having been said, right? Like I've said a lot of things that are pretty negative on the idea of like tank supports having, itemization options. I don't think that means that we can't have an item that has, a skew against magic damage, right? As an example, I've actually tested items that were like 40 MR, 20 armor for tank supports, right? I think that this would probably manifest more as this item is a little more skewed towards being good against magic damage than it literally only has magic, it has 60 MR, 200 health and 0 armor, right? Like I don't think we'd be very likely to make that item because I think that item is likely to just never be purchased. Basically, it would be the kind of item where it's correct to purchase in 1 out of every 40 games, and because of that, no one ever thinks of it even in that 1 out of 40 games, right? Like it just leaves the player perception. That's the one of the problems we've had with items like this in the past, where it's like, oh, it's a very narrow item, it's very good in this specific situation. Is okay, well, if it's only good in 1 out of every 20 or fewer games, people just aren't even going to think about it even in that 1 out of 20 games, right? It needs to have a certain baseline level of usefulness such that it's in players' minds and they actually think about the item. One of the problems that we've also run into in the past is if we make a cool item and then we staple a weird stat line to it that makes it really narrow, players actually get upset by that most of the time, right? A great example of this from the past is like Athene's, right, where it had MR on it. It was like, well, people wanted to buy the old Athene's in a lot of games, but the fact that it had MR on it made it more narrow and made it harder to purchase. And so it's kind of like a tough design task. It's like you have to make something that's functional, but not something that's so cool that people will want to buy it all the time. And so then it's like, okay, well, it needs a passive that's actually mostly going to be useful in that specific situation, but that's not really how we design support tank items, right? We design them with generically useful passives or passives that are useful for, certain teams. They synergize with your team, right? This is like Bandle Pipes giving, movement speed, or sorry, attack speed to your whole team. Or like Knight's Vow is good when you have a fed 80 carry, or just a fed like battle mage or whatever. Or Locket is good against like AoE damage. It's more about the enemy comp. But we don't as much design our tank support itemization for, oh, it counters this type of damage, right? In the same way that like Randuin's counters crit, or Frozen Heart counters like attackers, right? And so this becomes a really, really, really difficult design space. Um, and like I said, I think there is room for a MR skewed tank support item, and I think that would be great. And if you've ever heard me talk about this before, it's like I do think that tank support itemization needs multiple new items, right? Even I just made Battle Pipes, right? We just released that. I still think that we could make a lot more items in this space because they just have so few items, right? Like they have the smallest number of items of any subsystem, really, and they don't actually really have access to the income tank items because they just don't get enough gold, right? Buying a Force of Nature on a tank support is so difficult; it's just so much money. Um, but anyway, I do think we should make more items here, and I think maybe one or more of them could be skewed. But I think the idea of a pure MR item for tank supports is probably not that functional in reality in the actual game, right? It's just the kind of item that will almost never be optimal to buy, and players won't think about it, and therefore won't actually buy it, even in the rare scenarios when they're against double mage bot or whatever, right? And that it lets them buy a Negatron cloak first. This is part of a longer question about like lifesteal versus omnivamp, because Samira has lifesteal mods on her spells, but it's pointed out here is like omnivamp isn't modded anymore on AoE, right? And so therefore, because she has access to omnivamp on a item now on Endless Hunger, it feels off that lifesteal is actually worse on like her ultimate than omnivamp is. I do think this is weird. I think this is probably something we should think about. We should probably either say Omnivamp is also modded, like it just mods all vamp effects, and we just move on with our lives, or should we reconsider exactly how Lifesteal and her spells interact? It's definitely something I think that should be thought about. I will also note, by the way, that I do think that Endless Hunger is probably a bit too good on ranged currently, on ranged champions in general, and I suspect that at some point in the future we'll probably do a small reshape on the stats and like how like and the skew of the item, and like how the stats are arranged for melees versus ranged, and just in general for everyone. But I do agree this is weird, and we probably should take a look at it. This is something where it's like I should probably like someone should probably mention this to Squad 5, the designer who made Samira, and kind of get his thoughts and see what he thinks about this because I do agree it's pretty weird that now that we have an Omnivamp item, the Omnivamp item is actually better for Samira than Lifesteal, which feels kind of off. All right. Is there space for class archetype pivoting items, such as converting marksman power into bulk? And then they, there's a lot of text here. I didn't want to put it all into this document because it would make it hard to read and all that. But it's basically they gave an example of like, hey, this thing takes some of your crit damage and it converts your crit into resistances. This is a really interesting topic because this is something that actually gets created accidentally from time to time internally. This is something that like I've made one of these accidentally. For example, I had an item that converted your crit damage into magic damage, or a percentage of your crit damage into magic damage, scaling with some stuff. Anyway, the short answer is no. This one is one of the rare questions where I can give you a firm answer of just no. We will not make these items, and the reason why, at least under the design philosophy of the item system, it is extremely important that items are committal. That when you buy an item, everyone in the game can understand what your champion is going to do. This is one of the reasons why we don't just add an infinite number of items, right? Like we don't just, we haven't just been adding, 9 new items every single season for the past 16 season, and now we have, 560 items, right? It is really, really, really critically important that players can look at a build and understand intuit this is how a champion will operate with these items in their inventory, right? Oh, these items on Jax will do similar things. They don't have to do the exact same thing, but they'll do similar things to what they do on, Gnar or I don't know, Aatrox or whatever, right? Like name some other champion, right? Ezreal, whatever, right? It's extremely important for that to be true. And the problem with these types of items, right, which we've run into a number of times when we, accidentally make them internally, like in development, is imagine this scenario, right? Okay, let's use this specific example. You're playing against a crit vein. The crit vein gets really fed. Okay, the crit vein has Yuntal IE as their first 2 items or whatever, right? and you're playing Cho'Gath, and you're like, okay, Crit Vein is really fed. I'm going to get a Randuin's to counter the Crit Vein. Or even I'm Ornn, I'm going to get 300 armor because the enemy Jinx is really fed. And then suddenly, that 80 carry for their third or fourth item buys an item that pivots their output into something else. Your build no longer makes sense, right? You have been betrayed by the item system because the item system promised you, hey, you can buy this. It's effective against champions that crit, or this armor is effective against champions that deal physical damage, right? The example that I gave of a prototype I made where it like switched your crit damage to magic had this problem where you'd be playing Ornn against all AD. You build 300 armor, and then the enemy AD carry buys the magic damage item and then instantly kills you, right? Like they convert a bunch of their damage to magic, and it's like, okay, all your armor does nothing, right? Essentially, it is a betrayal. Like these types of items, at least when their output switches are meaningfully powerful, they are a betrayal of the information that the item system, or they're a betrayal of the promise of the item system, right? This is why, for example, you don't sell items for 95% of their gold cost and then switch your build, right? It's so that when you make a choice in the item system, it is committal. Everyone in the game can understand what's happening with your items. This is very, very important because it is part of how players learn and understand the game, is that they can hit tab, they can see this Varus has a Nashor's Tooth. And that is very different from a Varus that buys a Ghost Blade first item. And that is very different from a Varus that buys a Blade of the Ruined King first item, right? All of these things are different, and you can actually understand how that difference is going to play out over the course of the game. When we add these conversions in, when we give you the ability to convert your output, and you don't have to, think about this in the theoretical sense, right? Arena and Aram Mayhem actually have augments and prismatic items that do these things, right? Because they don't have the same level of, sanctity for the communication that the item system is giving people, right? And so it's actually pretty okay in those alternate game modes for an entire part of a champion's output to be converted into something else and to do something else. But in core SR, it's extremely important for the understandability of the game that when you buy something, you've committed and you have paid a cost to opt into a specific type of power so that everyone in the game can understand how that's going to work, right? And that's a core part of how players learn and develop their understanding of the progression of characters over time. And that's, as an example, one of the reasons why when you play a champion that you've seen people play 100 times before, you can already shortcut to parts of how they're playing and parts of understanding parts of how their kit work and things like this, right? This is really, really important for the structure of the game and the structure of how people learn the game and understand champions and understand the item system. And so, like I said, I think this one is just straight up a no. I don't think we can ever make these unless we significantly change how we understand or view the item system and how the item system is important to players learning the game. And that's all there is to it. All right. Champions monster modifiers tied to the jungle role. This should be roll. But this is something that's been talked about from time to time. It's not something we've committed to. It's something that we've talked. It comes up every so often, probably every couple months internally since role binding was made. Which, by the way, I actually am the designer who worked on role binding. I don't know if anyone knew that. But the original, not the role quests, but the original ones where you could select the roles in champ select, which is actually what enabled us to do role quests. Anyway, that's kind of irrelevant. I don't know why I'm talking about that right now. Anyway, so this is something that comes up from time to time. There are upsides and downsides. I personally think it is mostly upside, but there are some downsides, right? Here's an example I'm going to give you of one of the things that I think is actually a downside. If we did all jungle mods are attached to you are a jungler. Let's take a champion like Diana, for example. Now, Diana is more popular in the jungle, don't get me wrong, but she has a real mid lane pick rate, right? People do play her in mid. And I actually think it's good that she does extra damage to jungle monsters as a mid laner because it gives her a strategic strength that she wouldn't otherwise have, which is that she can farm jungle camps, and I think most importantly, she's actually very good at DPSing epic monsters, right? And the reason why I think that's actually good for her as a mid laner is because this gives her some outputs that are not literally just killing people, right? Because mid lane assassins have this problem, right? Like Zed has this problem, for example, where, uh, okay, here are your outputs. You are good at running around the map, you have a lot of mobility, and you kill people. You're not good at team fighting, right? Most of the mid lane assassins are not good at team fighting. Diana is a little better at team fighting than the others, so it's like, arguably, she needs this less than other assassins, right? But most of the mid lane assassins are not very good at team fighting, and they aren't good at split pushing. So their only way of progressing the game is just straight up killing people, often in 1-for-1s in larger scale fights, or if they're, if they're lucky, they can maybe find an isolated target, kill them for, without dying, right? And so this is one of the reasons, for example, why I made Bastion Breaker to try and help AD assassins specifically help close the game. But one of the reasons coming around to like why I think it's actually good for Diana to have strong monster damage, even as a mid laner, is that it means that she has an output, which is she's good at killing epic monsters. Like she's good at duoing Baron, for example, right? Like how often like if you played a lot of Diana mid, you know that there are situations you get into. It's like, oh, I have a new jungle. Let's go duo Baron. Like, oh, there's a fight breaking out bot side. We're gonna go 2-man Baron. That's like a real thing you could do that you can't do with most mid laners, right? Um, I think those kinds of outputs where it's like, oh, Diana has some real power in the mid lane specifically, as she's good at killing camps, good at farming camps to get herself ahead, and she's good at uh, hitting the epic monsters, which is a strength that makes her different from other mid laners. Gives her an output that means that she doesn't just have to one shot everyone that she touches in order to win games. I consider that a positive, right? Like essentially distributing some outputs of these champions into things that are fun for the people using them, right? Like I think that as someone who's played a lot of Diana mid, I personally think it's fun to like go blast a camp really quickly, even as a mid laner, or see that big number when you're doing the third hit cleave on the epic monsters or whatever. I think it's fun and also means that Diana can be powerful without instantly killing people that she touches all the time, right? Basically, it's lower frustration power, and it's fun power, which seems like an upside to me. Now, not every case is like this, right? I want to be clear about this. Like as an example, it's like Morgana support. I don't think is benefiting from jungle monster damage, right? As a briefer example. And so it's like, yeah, I think there's a lot of champions that wouldn't be harmed by jungle monster modifiers being attached to the jungle role. But I do think that there are cases where it's positive, where it's upside, where it can like defray power into things that can be positive for the champion. And so, yeah, the question is like, if we did this, would we want to do it for everyone? Would we want to do it only for some champions? Is that confusing? How would we want to display this information to players? There's a lot of questions that would need to be answered. And no one has actually done a project to say like, let's do a deep dive and investigate exactly how this should work if we want to do it. But like I said, it's something that gets talked about a lot internally. So I wouldn't be surprised if at some point we put some experimentation time onto this. This is an interesting question, which is would AD assassins be easier to tune if they didn't have 100% AD ratio autos? This actually gets at a really interesting point. I don't think I've ever talked about this on stream before, but it's a question of interpreted versus non-interpreted stats, right? So what an interpreted stat is AP, right? AP, the only meaning to AP is interpreted through your kit, right? Your abilities can have ratios, right? A non-interpreted stat is something like health, which maybe you do have a health ratio on your kit. We've got plenty of those, right? But health has an inherent meaning. When you buy 100 health, your champion requires 100 more damage to die, right? And they can hold 100 more current health, in your health bar, right? Similarly, like armor, MR, AD are all non-interpreted stats, but they are also interpreted in some cases, right? Like some champions have armor and MR ratios, right? You have your Gallios, your Malphites, your Ramesses, your Orns. Some champions have AD ratios. In fact, a lot of them have AD ratios, right? And so AD ends up being both, I would say, like, for the way that the game operates, it's kind of both an interpreted and a non-interpreted stat, in the sense that most, like, well, maybe not most, but a huge percentage of our kits actually interpret AD to do something, right? I don't know numbers wise how many it is. We got like 172 champions or whatever. It's probably like, I don't know how many champions have an AD ratio in their kit, like 80, maybe more. I have no clue. Anyway, point I'm getting at is that there's a distinction here between types of stats. And AD is a non-interpreted stat because it has a non-interpreted stat because it has an inherent meaning of your auto attacks deal 100% of your AD as damage, right? Um, so to get to the original question, would AD assassins be easier to tune if they didn't have 100% AD ratio autos? I'm going to spin into another tangent here, but I think this one actually is maybe even more relevant than the one I got to before of like defining what an interpreted versus a non-interpreted stat is. This season, we buffed crit damage to 200%. I was actually the one who was given this as a task. I didn't, I didn't like pitch this as an idea myself. I was given like, hey, do something about 80 carry crit damage, basically, make it higher. Basically make 80 carry auto attacks more powerful relative to their spells, right? So, there were two ways of doing this from my perspective. It's like one was I could just put all champions back to 200%, which is what we ended up doing, right? The other option, though, which I heavily considered, and honestly to this day I think maybe might be good, was what if we treated all champions as they interpret crit damage on their kit, or like we just set this differently for each champion, right? And what this might mean, as an example, is like, well, Trinimir's the big crit guy. Maybe he should have 210% crit damage. And Lucian has crit ratios, and we actually want him to be a caster. So maybe he's supposed to have like 180 or 190% crit ratio, and he'll still build crit, but his auto attacks won't be as good. Or maybe we're supposed to say his normal auto attacks have 180% crit ratio, but his second shot from his passive, because we want him to build haste or whatever, or play around his E refund. His second shot from his passive actually has a 210% crit multiplier, right? And we actually interpret this differently based on how we want the kit to function, right? We could do things like this, right? In the crit space, or the crit multiplier space, I guess I should say. However, in my case, time was limited. I didn't feel like I had enough confidence that it would be worth the time spent in order to test interpreted crit ratios. And so I just put them all at 200%, internally. We tested that and said, okay, we can nerf spells and this will work and it'll, meet the goals of the project I was given, basically. Okay, so that worked, right? So what about AD? Do we think that auto attacks would benefit from this? Maybe. There are a couple of key notes here that seem dangerous to me. One is this messes a lot with last hitting, right? AD, like the fact that auto attacks scale with AD is actually pretty important for last hitting. I think there's a version of this where it's only bonus AD has a reduced effect on auto attacks, which is more confusing, but maybe is more acceptable because obviously it doesn't mess as much with last hitting. But I think that ultimately, from my perspective, it's like, okay, how much are we going to lower this realistically, right? We still want, we're going to want, no matter what, we're going to want your auto attacks to scale with AD unless you're a special, outlier champion, right? I can imagine us making a specific kit where we're like, actually, your auto attacks don't scale with AD. They do something else, right? I could imagine a kit like that. But across the entire roster, I would expect, hey, when you buy a longsword on Zed, we probably want your auto attack damage to increase because that's what happens when you buy a longsword on every other champion in the game, right? And so it's not like we're going to make this 0%, right? So what percentages would we need to actually make it so that Zed is more castery and less incentivized to, go for the R auto attack, type gameplay? It's like, is 90% enough? Is 80% enough of your bonus AD on your auto attacks? I just suspect that the amount we would need to nerf your auto attacks to make it so that to give real power budget elsewhere on kits is pretty high, right? I suspect we start getting into like 75 and 70%, where we start to get to the point where assassins no longer care that much about auto attacking. I will also know it's like there's a lot of assassins that have auto attack payouts, right? Like look at like Talon and Nefuri, for example. And even Zed has an auto attack payout on his passive. And so it's like telling them that auto attacking is worse is kind of awkward in that way. Because we've structured a lot of our assassins to auto attack, right? Look at Kha'Zix, look at Rengar, right? They already want to auto attack because of their kits, and so telling them that that's bad is kind of odd to me personally. Or telling them that that's worse. And then the other thing that concerns me about the idea here is that, okay, let's suppose we say that Zed's auto attack only scales with 50% bonus AD. And maybe we buff his passive to compensate a little bit because, of course, we want him to still auto attack for his passive. But where else is that power budget going? Well, it probably has to go into his spells, right? Do you actually want a Zed that's a mage throwing Qs at you? I mean, I know some Zed players would want that, right? But like, do you think that it's easier to balance Zed when his shurikens do more damage? I don't think so, right? Like, a lot of our assassins are already their spell damage is already very high, and I'd actually consider auto attack damage to be a good place for their damage in a lot of cases, right? Auto attacks require you to stand still to actually like play your animation and attack someone, right? You commit to standing still and actually doing this, much like you commit to casting spells, right? And I think it's actually good for assassins if they have a point in their gameplay where they pause and do stuff, because a lot of the times the way that our assassin kits are structured, they're often casting their spells when when you can't actually interact with them, right? Like this is like Zed W queuing from out of your range, and then maybe swapping to his W, Ring, and then auto attacking you. At least when he auto attacks you, you have you can hit him with your Ari charm or whatever, right? You can hit him with a spell when he goes for that auto attack. And I think it's actually good that there's windows of opportunity for counterplay when assassins auto attack you. Now, obviously, there are exceptions here, where it's like Rengar is like auto attacking you while he's jumping at you at 1,000 speed or whatever, and that one's obviously tough, right? But ultimately, I generally consider it to be good that AD assassins want to auto attack you, and I'm kind of skeptical that we would get benefits from lowering their AD ratios, personally. Um, at least, not saying that there would be no upside, but I'm skeptical that the total like end result of doing something like this is actually good, because it means that their like assassin spells generally or their auto attack payouts on kit just have to be more powerful, because of course they still have to be balanced, right? And so I'm a little suspicious that this is actually like this would overall be positive. All right. Do we get someone to old style arena? This is a longer post that was going into like, hey, they specifically liked having a smaller number of teams and some of the properties of the old arena. This is like, again, I'm not going to spend much time on this because I don't work on the modes team. I think there are some properties that were cool about the old arena, right? As an example, the fact that there were a smaller number of teams and therefore the context of like building to counter your opponents and things like that were actually more real. I think that was cool. And that was closer and more representative. That aspect of it was closer and more representative of something like SR. And that's like, if we go back to what I was talking about earlier about like the class archetypes, pivoting items, like there are some things, there are some upsides and downsides to that. I can't promise, anything here, obviously. But I do think that there were some properties of the old arena that definitely could see it could be seen as hey, we want a mode that does A, B, C. Actually, these properties from the old arena do B really well, right? Like I could definitely see that happening at some point in the future. And of course, older versions of modes, they're always interesting, right? This is something that gets talked about from time to time of like, hey, what does like, were there some cool things about this older version of the mode that have been changed? Yeah, of course, right? Like, were there cool things about older versions of ARAM, for example, before we added some of the, like, as an example, like distance modifiers and healing punishments and stuff like that? Where it's like, we generally think that those are a positive for ARAM, but like that doesn't necessarily mean that there couldn't be especially a short time, like limited time mode that's mostly about novelty of like, hey, this property is different and it represent it's closer to something that used to be in the game. So could we get something like this? Yeah, sure. Will we? I don't know. Maybe not. All right. Is it correct for Jayce's fantasy that his best items are all lethality and no haste, especially in the jungle? Haste is nowhere to be found. I will say I think it's interesting because Jayce's fantasy has changed a lot over the years, right? When he first came out, the idea was that he was this hybrid fighter caster, right? Like his range form, he's sort of a mage, like sort of mage-like. Of course, he has auto attack stuff, right? It's targeted, but he's sort of mage-like. He's sort of artillery magey, and then he transforms into a bruiser, right? And then over time, as the melee form was nerfed, he became more and more about the artillery. Well, initially it was artillery was nerfed because he was so good at being an artillery mage, and then it switched around to okay, artillery is getting buffed as we just generally made artillery effects in League worse over time, and the melee form was nerfed because he was so powerful in Pro, and so it's like, oh, he's actually less and less of a fighter, and then more and more of an artillery mage. And then we kind of switched back, right, during, like, this was not that long ago, like, what, 3-4 years ago, we had a, like, actually legitimate fighter build. Even more recently, he had, with Unending Despair, he had, like, a very good, like, actual, like, hardcore fighter build where he wasn't an artillery mage at all. And then in the modern day, he's more switched around to, yeah, you just build a bunch of lethality and you build a bunch of damage. I don't have a super strong opinion on what is the correct fantasy for Jayce to have. I personally think it's interesting if he has different builds that are good. That I think that's a positive. I will say, from my perspective, I do think that the sort of baseline fighter gameplay of Jayce isn't very interesting, right? Because he doesn't really have any variance. It's you targeted dash onto people and slow them, and then you just have a damage field, and then you have a knockback. It's like, okay, well, as a fighter, Jayce, you don't really have any interesting tools that really do much that like is compelling to me, right? It's like where is your like spammable, where is your Jax W or your Jax E, right? Like where is your spell that like creates combat variance or has any interest? But I don't think it's wrong that he has a build that could be a little fightery, personally. Like if that were true. So I guess my summary of like my answer to this question is like Jayce's fantasy has been all over the place as he's built different items over the years. I don't necessarily know if like how attached Jayce players are to being an artillery mage. Um, Also, I will note when you're building full lethality, sure you don't spam your artillery, but you do a lot of damage when you do land the QE, right? So I don't know if not having haste is really a detriment to the artillery mage fantasy. It obviously makes sense, especially as a jungler, that you would just build for maximum damage when you interact with people because you're choosing when you interact, right? And of course, building damage means you clear faster and all of that, right? So I would say ultimately, like, I don't have a good answer for you because Jayce's fantasy could be a lot of different things and has been a lot of different things. And the way that I look at Jayce, I say, uh, his melee gameplay could probably be more interesting. Um, but at the end of the day, part of what makes him interesting is swapping forms. And if his build is making him do interesting things in both forms, cool, right? I personally dislike the builds, and I think the haste actually does lend itself more to this, where Jayce is heavily encouraged to just sit in one form forever, right? Like the despair, the unending despair tank builds that he was doing, a few years ago, um, encouraged him to sit in melee form a lot, right? Like most of the time. The pure haste caster artillery mage builds heavily encourage him to sit in ranged form all the time. At least the max lethality builds, you're heavily encouraged to say like, oh, you should transform and like get your melee spells off because they do a lot of damage, and then you can transform back, and then and by that time your gate will be up and you can fire another shock blast or whatever, right? You don't need to stay in your ranged form to just spam shock blast all the time. I actually like that aspect of him not having a ton of haste. Is that right? I don't know. And to be honest with you, I don't necessarily know what the Jayce players actually want, right? Like I wouldn't say that I'm super in tune with that audience. So ultimately, at the end of the day, I think it's like as long as the gameplay is acceptable, what do the Jayce players actually find most fun? That's probably where we should try to push his build. All right, this is a longer one. This is one of the only longer ones where I actually copied the whole text because I thought it was actually like relevant for the discussion. So let's read this out. Champion versus item. How much of a champion's upsides and downsides are the responsibility of items as opposed to kit design? I've been playing. Oh, I actually didn't realize it was cut off. My bad. I've been playing Renata as an enchanter for the first time with Helia Diadem combo, and it feels good to be able to play her as an actual enchanter now. But it got me thinking about how items have only done so much for her and how her kit needs tweaking to feel better. Projectile speed buff, please. By the way. So for the average champion, how much of their kit is designed to ignore items, and how much of it is meant to utilize items, and how do the champ teams and item teams you work together or not work together to decide that? So this is a very complicated question, and I will tell you right straight up, you are not going to get like a perfect answer to this question ever. Because it's nebulous, right? It's going to vary from champion to champion. It's going to vary from time to time, right? As an example, 14-19 nerfed all the items in the game, or pretty much all of them, right? And so, of course, that means that more power was coming from champion kits. During the time period of Mythics, more power was coming from items, and so therefore less power was coming from champion kits, right? So this varies from patch to patch, year to year, season to season, right? And so there's not one universal answer. I will say Renata as a specific example here is like, well, she's an interesting outlier. There's a few champions like this I would identify, like Renata, Bard, and then to a lesser degree Thresh, as champions that don't really scale with stats, right? There are no stats that are actually particularly good on these champions, and so they much more sharply feel the unique effects of items because unlike everyone else, they don't really care about the stats that they're buying, or at least they don't care as much, right? Because their kits scale in very bizarre, strange ways, and they're ranged, and so they're not as in need of tank stats as like a Leona. That's not that point's not super critical, but it's just like I will note that those, there are some outlier champions who feel the unique effects of their builds more sharply, right? Like Bard, I think is a particularly great example of like, there's been Bard builds when, your build is, oh, actually your first item is Dead Man's and then you buy Rapid Fire Cannon and Leandry's or whatever, right? Like I think his build right now is like Leandry's second or something insane like that, right? It's completely deranged. And that's because the unique effects of the items are what he cares about, not actually the stats so much as, other champions do. Um, and that varies from champion to champion, right? Some champions care more about stats, some champions care less, right? Juggernauts, for example, care a lot about stats. And that's one of the reasons why I made Overlord's Bloodmail is like, hey, this was originally made for Juggernauts to be able to scale their stats, right? That's why the item just gives stats. That's all it does. They don't, the Juggernauts don't need unique effects as much because their kits support them in ways that other kits don't necessarily support them, right? And so they just want to have a lot of stats, AD and health. Cool, awesome. I'm Darius. I get a bunch of AD and health. I'm Set. I get a bunch of AD and health. Cool, awesome, right? So I think one of the more interesting parts of this question is like how do champs and item teams work together or not work together to decide. That is, this is something that comes up a lot when we're working on newer champions, where there's a lot of questions around like, do the item systems work for this champion? Do we need to make changes? The answer, by the way, is almost always they already work and we don't need to make changes, right? There's often suggestions floated for changes to the item system. Item systems when we make champions, right? As an example, when we were making Mordekaiser VGU years back, there was a proposal at the time to actually remove Gunblade from the game because at the time we believed that Gunblade would cause problems for Mordekaiser in his build structure if we wanted to have an AD ratio, right? And so there was a proposal to do that. It did not end up happening, of course. We removed Gunblade years later, and then now we've re-added it. But of course, with a much less powerful slow and a much longer cooldown. I actually, for what it's worth, suspect that at a more powerful slow with a lower cooldown, Mordekaiser with an AD ratio on his Q probably does build Gunblade. But because the passive is not that powerful on the current version, that doesn't become a problem. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. So this often comes around from, hey, at the end of the day, we do not make items for one champion, right? We'll actually get to this. I think there's like one or two more questions about this, or like that touch on this topic later on. Is like one champion is not allowed to hostage the item system, right? As an example, I made it. I was experimenting with an alternative to Deathcap years ago that gave you haste based on your AP, and a lot of people immediately told me like, "Oh, you're not allowed to make that because Vhagar exists." Right? It's like, well, that's not really true, right? Like if we thought the item was good enough, like let's suppose that there were 5 champions that we thought really benefited from this item. We would just change Vhagar to make sure it worked correctly because the systemic benefit would, outweigh the costs basically, right? And that is how items work, is that items cannot be hostage by singular champions. When you start getting into like 3 or 4 champions, okay, the costs might start to outweigh the benefits unless the item is really doing something amazing. But ultimately, the reality is that champions it's funny because League is absolutely a champion fantasy first game, but champions actually have to sort of bend to the item system in some ways, right? This is why, for example, Mordekaiser has percent penetration on his E, because when we made Mordekaiser, there was not a good option for him to actually enable himself to be functional against targets buying a bunch of MR, right? Today, we actually have Bloodletter's Curse to fill that space, and so maybe if we made Mordekaiser today, would we have that? Maybe, maybe not, right? Maybe we would make it differently. We'd make it lower reliability. We'd say, hey, when your E pulls someone, it shreds their MR or something like that, because you can already buy MR shred from Bloodletters, and so we don't want as much power budget in that effect, right? But we made Mordekaiser the way we made him, and it's totally fine, I think. But we structure champions the way that they need to be structured to work with the item systems that we have. This is one of the reasons why when we change the item systems, sometimes we need to change champions like Kaisa, for example, who has her unique, interaction with the item systems. And, like when we changed the item systems back in season 14, for example, we then had to give her, I think, more AD per level because she didn't have the right combination of items to get her breakpoints, or maybe it was AS per level. I don't remember. We buffed one of those at some point because the item system no longer, functioned correctly for her, right, to get her evolved breakpoints. But ultimately, the answer here is mostly that champions bend to the item system. because we cannot allow the item system to be hostage by one champion, because that's not a sustainable practice. It just, that's just not realistic, because the item system has to serve everyone. Whereas the champion is a self-contained unit. The champion in and of itself can be changed in isolation, whereas the items cannot be changed in isolation, right? Changing an item specifically to fit Kai'Sa or, Renata, for example, means that it has splash damage effect on, 10 plus other champions potentially, right? And so that's actually ends up being not only more work, but more risky overall, right? And so the champions, because they're the self-contained units in this situation, have to be the ones that bend rather than the item system, even though League is champion fantasy first, over items, right? Over systemic fantasy. So hopefully this gives you a good sort of perspective or understanding of this space. It's a really interesting topic. This is something where it's like, at some point, if I'm streaming and you want to hear more about this, I'd be happy to talk about it more, but I don't want to sit here and talk about this for, 30 more minutes, because let's see. This video is already an hour and 5 minutes long, and I've still got plenty of questions to get through. So let's move on. All right. What was the reasoning for the Mythic item system in the first place, and what was learned from it? Fun part of this is that I think these two things are very heavily tied together. So the Mythic item system originally was designed as a way to create intentional choice structure for players, right? The idea being that if we created a system where there was very clear choice points for players and there was variance from game to game in builds for most or all champions, the idea was that, number one, players would be satisfied with this, because one of the things that repeatedly came up in player surveys around the time was like, hey, we want more we want more items to build, we want more variance in our items, we want to not build the same thing every game. That wasn't, I would say that wasn't really true. This is one of the cases, I think, of like players asking for something but not really understanding what they were asking for, and not actually wanting that thing exactly. They wanted something similar to that thing, or something that felt like that thing, but not necessarily that thing exactly. But we'll talk about that more later. Anyway, and from a design perspective, getting more variance in builds, or more variance from game to game, is always a positive, right? It's like part of the reason why League is such an awesome game that you can play for thousands and thousands of hours is that no two games are the same, right? You could even load in, right, even beyond just champion picks, but like load the same 5 champions on both sides into a game with the same 10 players, and the games will not play out exactly the same every time. They'll be different, right? People will build different items. People will have different gold, like different states of gold. People will get different objectives. People will be in different places on the map, and so on and so forth, right? The games will not play out similarly at all, even if the champions are the same. And so the idea was, hey, we could add even more layers of variance if, especially in first item, you choose different items. Now, I will say one of the biggest problems with Mythics is that the system of here is one really powerful item that you have to choose between. Really, that system only makes sense if it's your first item. But if it's your first item, it's also not that in and of itself causes problems. I don't necessarily want to get into like a deep dive analysis of the Mythics. This is another topic where it's like, you want to hear more about this, catch my stream or ask me another question or whatever, because this is like a topic I could talk about for a long time. And it's interesting, but I don't want to get too in the weeds on this. But anyway, the big things I think we learned were like, number one, that if you have one really powerful item you're offering a lot of choice on, first item is not the place for that item, which means that the Mythic system doesn't really make sense, right? Because if you're asking people to make a really powerful choice, it kind of has to be first, or you're going to cause problems with like pacing of like, oh, the first person to 2 items wins because they got their Mythic, or the first person to 3 items wins because they got their Mythic, or this class has their Mythic second and this class has their Mythic third, and therefore this class is now now skewed earlier in the game because they have their Mythic second slot or whatever. Is like, all of that stuff's not really feasible to deal with. And so the Mythic kind of, like, if you're making a singular, more powerful choice, it kind of has to be the first slot. But that doesn't really work, because the first slot is where it's best to put fantasy, like binding fantasy building items, like Trinity Force, for example, right? Where, oh my god, I'm Jax, Trinity Force is awesome for me. It offers me everything that I want. Or, hey, I'm, what's a good example? Another good example is like, I'm Brand and I want Leandries. This is the perfect item for me. I want to buy it as soon as possible. Well, that should be your first slot. And if you have Mythics in that slot, that means that we can't give you your perfect fantasy binding item in the first slot, because we have to give you choice there instead. And we're not going to come up with 3 options that are as exciting and as awesome as Leandries is on Brand, right? Or as Trinity Force is on Jax, or whatever, right? And so these sort of problems sort of break down the system, and you can kind of see why mythics as a structure don't work. The biggest learnings are that, number one, that the exact structure we use for mythics doesn't work, and number two, I think that most players don't really care, especially in the early slots, if their build has real choice, right? You can see the way that most champions work is that most champions have a core binding item that they buy first, or maybe two options, right? Some champions have more than that, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's good, I would say, right? But that's not necessarily good for all champions. It's good that everyone has. Sorry. It is more important that your first item feels good than that you feel like you have a choice. That is, I think, the core learning of the mythic system is that choice is less important than your item feeling good. And when we prioritize choice over feel, that creates these rough situations where players will often buy items that feel worse, or they will suffer because they buy the item that feels better for their champion, and they will then lose less because they didn't optimize around having a choice. And that's sort of a damning trap. That is, this was the main argument I used when I proposed removing the mythic system from the game. Of like, okay, this is a no-win situation for the player, right? You feel good, or you optimize. And you generally want to be sure that your optimizations feel good, right? This is a core game design lesson, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be that the most fun thing is always the most optimal thing, but you want your optimal thing to be fun always. Because the reality is players will optimize themselves out, like a lot of optimizers in your games will optimize themselves out of having fun if you let them. And so this is one of the problems with having really, really deeply unfun, for most players, optimizations in the game, is that people who want to win will do them, and they will have less fun doing it, and then they will just not have fun playing your game, and they might stop playing your game. They might just have less fun. But generally, you want your players to be having fun, right? And so that's leading into a lot of these other problems. I'm getting way too deep on this, but I would say that to sort of sum it up is the feel of your items is much more important. Like, or your items feeling good is much more important than you having choice. And the natural structure of the League of Legends item system leads to you having choices later in your build for most champions anyway, right? Like, look at most fighter builds, for example, where it's like most fighters are hardbound to like one, maybe two items, but then the later their build goes, the more choices they have. And that's totally awesome, because it means that for the optimizers that want to select the best items every game and actually get rewarded for that, they get to do that in most games. But everyone, in the game gets to feel good about buying their first, Trinity Force or Thundered Sky or Ravenous Hydra or whatever your first item happens to be. And those choices start to branch out as you get further and further into the game. And we found that that's just a much better structure than trying to jam that choice into the first slot, because the first slot is where it's most important that your champion feels like your champion and feels like they're being enhanced by the item system in the way that makes the most sense for them, right? This is the, the Trinity Forces, the Liandries, the Blackfire Torches, the Lich Banes, the Dusk and Dawns even now, right? Like the enhancements that feel like they're made for your champion. We want to make sure that you actually get those in most or all of your games. And so the mythic system structure doesn't really make sense. Let's move on from this one, because I think that's good. I don't want to keep spending more time on that. Hopefully that's a good enough answer for people. All right. Fizz itemization is bad. Sorry, that is a really funny way of putting this. Can Riot add an AP assassin item with haste for Fizz? So this is a short answer, is like I said, one champion is not going to hostage the item system in the same way that we're not going to make an item just for one champion. If we thought that it was, that there's good space for an AP assassin item with haste on it, that could be good for Fizz. I will note, it's like, I look at Fizz and I say, okay, so where would this item even go? He's hard, like he's pretty bound to Lichbane. If he's not buying Lichbane, he's buying mana. I will note that I think that the fact that Fizz, like the win rates and that the power, like the actual factual power building mana items is actually pretty high on Fizz, that feels wrong to me personally. And I think that we should probably reduce Fizz's mana costs because it's crazy to me that this, this melee assassin feels like he has to buy a 600 mana item in some games to actually function. That just doesn't really feel right to me personally. But anyway, could we make an item in this space? Probably, right? Like, who else is a potential user? Maybe Echo, maybe LeBlanc, right? Like, there are other AP assassins that like haste, but Fizz kind of uniquely likes haste a lot. And when I look at his item builds, it's like, okay, let's suppose, imagine I wave a magic wand and I solve his problems with mana. He's going to be back to being hardbound to Lichbane. And then his second items are like, okay, you're going to buy Storm Surge or Sonya's probably, right? Those are really, really, really attractive items for this champion. Where do you even fit this item? Is this item, you think it's going to replace one of the second items? You think you're going to buy this over Storm Surge for killing people or Sonya's for survivability? Or you think you're going to buy a third over like one of the other great items that you could buy, like a Death Cap or Void Staff, right? Or Crypt Plume even, right? Like I'm struggling to see where this item would fit in Fizz's current build without some changes to it. Now, I'm not saying Fizz is perfect, right? As an example, I personally think he should have missing health damage on his W again, and I think he should have lower mana costs. I think there's work that could be done to make him better. But I actually struggle to see on the current version of the champion where a new item would even fit into his build that would make sense for him. Because I don't think it's first, right? This is the Lichbane champ, right? Like I think that seems hard to get away from. And so I'm not actually seeing tons and tons and tons of value for Fizz, except as maybe like a situational second item or third item option, which makes me a little skeptical of this structure. But that having been said, maybe it could be good for other champions too. And so adding an item in this space could be good for them, good for the Wonks, good for the Echoes, good for, some other, AP assassins that care about haste, right? Why do mana-related stats not count for items passive in manaless champions? Short answer here is just because that's how it's set up. I don't think that anyone's really spent a lot of time thinking about it. It's like we generally look at Actualizer, right? I think we've generally taken the stance of we want the item system to support mana. We do not care if manaless champions feel bad about seeing cool items with mana on them. Because manaless champions have the advantage of not having mana, right? Mana is strictly a disadvantage to have, right? Like if we put mana on Garen, for example, he would just be worse, right? It's just strictly a disadvantage, right? And so we don't really care that much if manaless champions are like, oh man, that mana passive looks so cool. It's like, okay, well, you have the benefit of not having mana. So that's fine, right? As an example, like Actualizer, you can actually buy it if you don't have mana. You just can't activate it, right? Because it requires you to have mana to use it, right? And I've kind of taken the philosophy on over the years of like, I think we should have more itemization that rewards you for building or investing in mana, right? This is why I made Actualizer, for example, was, hey, I want an item that makes you feel good about having a lot of mana. That's why it doubles your mana cost and gives you a huge payout for that, right? I think that's a positive, right? And so it's like, I think we could have more items in this space that make you feel good about having mana. And I don't really care about manaless champions feeling like there are cool items or cool effects that they can't necessarily access because they have an inherent advantage in this space that they don't have to worry about their mana at all. So to me, I just don't think this is a problem, or at least it's not a problem that I think is worth solving because it's sort of correlated to the fact that the manaless champions already have an inherent advantage over the mana champions. All right. When are the next item changes going to focus on? Are we going to see more item rework or new ones? So I can't answer this actual question, and obviously this is not a place for me to talk about upcoming work because this is just my personal channel where I talk about stuff. But I will say from my perspective, I think we'll see how the 9 new items that were just made play out. But from my perspective, I think priority for the immediate future is more likely to be on reworks to systems, potentially fleshing out existing systems, right? As I was talking about earlier, I think that support tank itemization for support tanks could definitely use more items. But I think that we're more likely to focus on like, hey, here is a revamp to these 4 items than you are to see like 4 new items as an example, right? Because we just filled out a lot of space in the item system. And while there are, I definitely think there are more spaces that could be filled. For me personally, I think there's more opportunity space, especially like what I would consider to be like low-hanging fruit, like high opportunity for lower cost in the rework space currently. Like the on-hit item space, I think, for example, could use a reshape, right? Which might include new items, maybe it doesn't, right? But as an example, the first item choice point between Blade of the Ruined King and Kraken Slayer, I think, is not particularly well structured currently, right? Kraken Slayer is themed as you're killing Krakens, right? You're killing big things. But Blade of the Ruined King is actually the one that's good against tankier people, and Kraken is good against squishier people. And the items are so close together, it's pretty hard to tell on a given champion, outside of looking at win rate, why would you want to buy one versus the other, right? So like fixing structural problems like that, I think is a space that has a lot of like there's a lot of opportunity spaces like that seem like pretty ripe opportunities to me, more so than new items. But hey, I love making new items, so if it were up to me, I'd probably do both, right? If I were working on another items project. So who knows? But I personally think you're more likely to see reworks in the immediate future rather than new items. All right. This is another interesting question where I was talking about, it was a much longer post about like old Cassante, I think, enjoying things about old Cassante, et cetera, right? One thing I will note about the perspective of a lot of people on older versions of champions, especially ones that were like, it had mechanics stripped and, and or were slowed down, especially like a lot of people have this idea, which I don't think is correct, around like, oh, if pro didn't exist, Cassante would still be the same thing. No, that is not true, right? Like, the older version of Cassante was not acceptable from a gameplay perspective, right? I think specifically going back to the original version where he could like true combo you from 400 range into a wall and one-shot people, like, or like kill people from like very high levels of health, without really much gameplay. You would like literally need to like flash his EW, like E tap W is like that I think was just not an acceptable output for a champion at a baseline. There are a lot of things about older versions of Cassante that I do not think were acceptable from a gameplay perspective, a gameplay health perspective, right? It is not okay if someone is good enough at Cassante that they can true combo you from range, into a wall, take you away from your team, and kill you, right? If you're a squishy. That's probably not going to fly. Now, on an individual level, could there be parts of Cassante that are faster? Could there be parts where he gets back some choices? Maybe, right? This is something where I will note that, like, from a pick rate perspective, like, I totally get it, right? I played the original Cassante. Absolutely, it was more fluid. Absolutely, there were some parts of it that I found more fun. 100%, don't get me wrong. And I'm sure a lot of people feel similarly. But the current Cassante is actually just about as popular as Cassante was once his pick rate, from after the initial release died out, right? Like, new champions always have a good pick rate. Once he's settled at like sort of like a resting pick rate, the pick rate he has today is actually pretty similar to what we consider like his resting pick rate on the previous version. So it's not like some of the other older champions, right? Like this was like LeBlanc, the LeBlanc assassin rework, for example, where hey, she got her assassin rework and her resting pick rate had actually plummeted, right? We just had no audience for the newer, or not no audience, but like we had a very small audience for the updated LeBlanc, and so she got reverted to the previous one, so that at least some those older players could play her, and even if it was not a super huge audience, it was still a dedicated group of players that did want to play her. Cassante is not like that, right? Cassante has a similarly sized group of players that are still playing the new one, that like the new version of Cassante, that is early game skewed, that is very strong in lane, that does have the current properties. Now, I think it's pretty clear. There is an audience of Cassante players that would prefer a more fluid version, a faster version. The question is, can we find a way to serve both of these audiences at the same time while dodging the gameplay health issues that the old Cassante had? I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. That's a very tough space. This is one where I would say, like, I'll be honest with you, it's something that is just, I think that any designer that is willing to take risks on changing Cassante to be faster, that's a bold move, right? And that's a dangerous thing to do, because there's a lot of risks in this shape of champion being faster and being more fluid and being able to combo his abilities more easily and in more fluid ways, because the end result of that is that it often, like, all of those things, like the reason why we took a lot of this stuff out was because a lot of it removes gameplay for the opponents. It removes counterplay. Ultimately, at the end of the day, part of the fundamental problem with Cassante was not just that he was really powerful in the hands of skilled players, but specifically that a lot of the skill was in removing your opponent's ability to do anything about your actions, right? That when you got good enough, you could remove counterplay, right? That's the most dangerous thing for skilled play to do, because that is the kind of thing that leads into not only really extremely frustrating gameplay, for sure, right? That is one thing that it definitely does, but also in that it means that at the highest levels of play, whoever gets their hands on the champion, their opponents actually lose the ability for their skills to matter, right? Where, oh, yep, I got comboed into a wall by Cassante. They executed perfectly. There was literally nothing I could do. The only thing I could have done was not to be within 400 units of Cassante, ever, right? Like that was my only counterplay. It's like, well, that's not really a good state of the game, right? We want people to have, ability to deal with their opponents, and obviously, like some of the things I'm saying are exaggerated, right? Like for sure, but the more fluidity and speed we give to this champion specifically, the less count. Like the way that this champion's kit specifically uses those things is mainly to remove counterplay from his spells, and that's a really scary thing to be. But all of this having been said, are there parts of the kit we could make more fluid without causing these issues? Probably, right? As an example, one of the things that I've noted when playing him is like, could the W dash itself be a little faster? Probably, right? Like, it's the kind of thing where, like, what if W dash speed scaled with rank, right? And it was a little better late game, such that, you didn't, such that in the early lane it wasn't, a great escape and it wasn't, super easy to land or anything like that. But it became a little bit more functional later on. I'm talking about the base W, not RW, right? RW I think probably should be the same, but base W dash speed I think could maybe be a little faster over game time, as an example, right? That seems like it could be some a place that would be reasonable. But the question is like, do we want to take that risk at any point, right? Because there's always risk, right? I could definitely be wrong that maybe that's fine, right? That could be something that totally could break something. And do we think that risk is worth taking? Not sure, right? It's a tough space because obviously, yeah, there were some things about old Cassante that felt amazing, that were awesome, like that felt really fluid and amazing to play with, but not so, we're not so healthy, let's say, in terms of offering your opponents the ability to actually respond to the actions that you're performing. All right. Is there an item design space where Cosmic Drive gets broken up into 2 items? Squishy Mage is Big Haste without HP, and then AHMS Synergy. Interestingly enough, something I was thinking about recently when I was doing my item changes, I probably should have tested this. In Wild Rift, the Cosmic Drive that I made there actually had the movement speed on the passive scale with ability haste, which I thought was really cool. Maybe I should try that out for SR at some point, like PC SR. Could be pretty cool. For the AHMS Synergy, I think there's something cool there for sure. Anyway, the theory here I think is sound. It's actually interesting if you look at Horizon Focus, right? Horizon Focus is the item that was being asked for here before I reverted it to the Artillery Mage version. Is the idea was like, hey, here's a big AP, big haste item for control mages, right? Like the theory that we had internally in 1419 when Horizon Focus was, it had the damage passive removed and was turned into the AP haste stat stick. The theory of that item was, oh, this would be really cool for control mages. The actual reality was that no one bought it. And some of that was probably signaling, right? It said that it was an artillery mage item. But I think that just the fact that the item was tuned to be very powerful, and then the only person buying it was Vlad, does go to showcase that ultimately this idea of the like huge AP, huge haste stat stick is not that compelling actually, and it's not actually something that is going to be purchased in and of like in its own on its own merits. And so we would need, if we wanted that item to work, we would need a unique passive that actually makes sense there. Not something like Horizon Focus that was basically a pure stat stick in that space, like the previous version of Horizon Focus, not the reverted one. And so could it be split into 2 items? Yeah, probably. But I suspect what we'd actually do is lean Cosmic Drive as it is now harder into the haste scaling space or harder into the health space, and then make a new item to occupy that AP haste stat stick. That having been said, I did spend a lot of time working on iterations in that space, and I didn't really find anything super good. I'm sure there's something there, but it's a more difficult space to make good items for than you would expect. At least it was more difficult for me. Maybe someone else would have an easier time. I'm not sure. But I did spend one of the item spaces, right? The item that would eventually become the slot. It wasn't a very different item at the time, but like the slot that would eventually go to actualizer. Like I spent most of my time iterating on items for the big AP, big haste space, because I was still operating under the assumption that there was value in that space for control mages. But we've kind of consistently found that they don't actually need that item at all. It's not like just that stat line alone is not good enough. And so we need to find the right unique effect to go there, is how I would put it. All right. What about AP/crit/armor scaling on champions that never build it? Is there room to add weird scalings to characters that never build these stats? I love trying champions in new ways. Short answer is like probably, right? It can be dangerous. I will say that some of our, hey, we added AP scalings for fun, those have gone wrong at times, right? And so we have to be careful about how we do these. If make sure that we do these in ways that actually make sense for the champions, and such that if the build is functional at all, such that it's a build that like has acceptable outputs, right? That aren't supremely messed up. And like don't have gameplay health issues of like counterplay issues or readability issues or whatever. Um, but yeah, I think that there's space for these. I will say crit and resist scalings are harder to theme, right? As an example here, it's like, okay, let's look at like Warwick, for example. Okay, what are we going to theme on Warwick's kit to scale with crit or resistances? Like his E, I guess, could like maybe scale with resistances. Like the damage reduction, is that even good? Like resistances are already giving you damage reduction effectively, right? Does that make sense? Like, I don't think so. Do we want this champion to scale with crit? Like, should his R scale with crit or something? Would we want a full crit Warwick to just kill people with his R? Probably not, right? So I think there's a lot of questions where when you actually dig into kits, it's kind of like, okay, a lot of these weird scalers don't feel like a lot of kits have good bindings for them. But I mean, are there spaces where we could do it? 100%, right? Like absolutely, there's got to be spaces where we could put weird scalings on kits and they would not cause problems and would just cause fun off builds that would have fine gameplay. The question is just always, are we spending time on that? Like, is that the thing that we should be spending time on as opposed to other things that we could spend our time on? I don't know. Sometimes it's probably good, sometimes probably not. So yeah, there's room for sure. It's just time investment comparatively to time investment on other things. All right. Why is there an attack speed cap? This one's interesting. I think there's actually a couple of quack shorts up of me talking about this a little bit. I can't tell you exactly in the original days of League why they did this, right? This is one of those things that's just like, yep, original League had an attack speed cap. Why did they do it? I have no clue. Like what their original motivations were. This is the kind of thing where it's like, maybe they did it because they thought animations looked bad at high levels of attack speed. Maybe they did it because they realized Phantom Dancer was one of the most powerful items in the game and they didn't want people buying 5 Phantom Dancers. Maybe they did it because I have no idea, right? Like there are all sorts of reasons they could have done this. Maybe they had a great design reason for it. I don't know. The real question here is like, why is there still an attack speed cap? Do we think it's good, right? Like why do we keep it in the game, right? What do we think is positive about this? Well, there's a couple of things, right? I think that there are certain effects in the game that probably need to be capped, right? A great example of this is Callista passive, right? If you've seen any of those videos from Era Mayhem of like Tap Dancer Callista just like flying around the screen at 10 AS or whatever, that is not acceptable, right? In a game mode, where we care about like the sanctity of the game, right? Like the Callista cannot control their character. No one in the game can click on the Callista. That's like obviously that's not going to fly, right? There are some effects. I think Callista passive being the best example that probably need to be capped. And that's true. I think the old Kog'Maw, the 5.0 AS Kog'Maw is also a good example of here of like capping attack speed at a reasonable number makes the game more playable, right? Like if there are ever situations where we let people get to like 4 or 5 AS, that champion becomes pretty like that champion is like literally not playable, even by extremely skilled players. And that makes things tough, right? Like look at the old Kog'Maw. If you think about it, right, let's suppose you have 5 AS on the 5.0 AS Kog'Maw, right? For those of you not familiar, there was a version of Kog'Maw we had in the game for a while where his W would double your attack speed and double the cap to 5 at the time. So you were basically a turret, right? You would pretty much have to stand still because moving would cause you to cancel your attacks most of the time. Scripters could perfectly cancel the attacks, but think about the inputs here, right? It's like, okay, so League servers are 30 hertz. You're attacking 5 times per second. So you have 5 3-frame windows every second that you have to input twice incorrectly. So you have to click attack, click move, and you're essentially asking the player every server frame, 20 out of the 30 frames, you need to be inputting a correct command. And you can slip by 1 on the movement command specifically. You have to get the attack command perfectly correct on the right frame. So you're talking about 5 frame perfect inputs per second, and 5 inputs that have to be 1 of 2 frames per second. that is not really humanly feasible to do for extended periods of time, right? If you're thinking about like speedrunning comparisons here, you're thinking like, oh, but there are speedrunning tricks that require like, you know, six consecutive frame perfect inputs or whatever. It's like, well, keep in mind, you know, and it's like, and this is just clicking the ground and clicking a person or a moving or whatever. And it's like, keep in mind the situation changes, right? In League, it's like you're going to need to click the ground in a different spot, and like, you know, you're not able to practice the exact situation here. It's not quite exactly comparable to like, you know, the exact situation this would be in like a speed run, or something along those lines, or like performing a speed run trick with like frame perfect inputs or whatever. But anyway, getting at the point here is just like, this is not really playable for anyone, including the best players in the game, right? They will make mistakes, right? They will not be able to do this. And that's fine, right? I think it's fine to have things in the game that are not playable, for the best players in the game, that they can't execute perfectly. But this is to the point where like it feels like it's so extremely far off. Where yeah, at really really high levels of attack speed, you're not even really gonna be rewarded for kiting, and before you even get to 4 AS, this is already going to be unplayable for most players, right? So I think the attack speed cap does do some good things in terms of you don't have to optimize kiting as hard, right? Like the game can be more playable, for, you know, typical players, which is difficult. I think at 3 AS we're kind of already pushing this, by the way, since we've raised the AS cap. We're already pushing it a little bit. I think it was fine, right? Because there were some champions that were running into the AS cap, which feels bad. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's like there aren't really optimized builds that that would get 4 AS anyway. And so having the AS cap lets us kind of nicely solve some outlier edge cases of, yeah, this isn't like 5 AS is not playable for players, right? You can't do it. We'd probably like to have most things in the game be playable if possible. So that's kind of nice, right? And so that's kind of the end of like, I think why at least I personally am in support of having a cap on the AS at this point. You know, I will say it's like, is there an alternate version of League where we structure the way that attacks work slightly differently at high levels of attack speed, and then we just say like Callista passive has a cooldown or something, and we manage a couple of other, you know, like outlier champions that way? It's like, maybe, right? But like, is that better than just having a cap? The cap is pretty simple and easy to understand, right? And so I think the cap is kind of like, seems like it's just kind of doing some good work, right? I think that's pretty reasonable. All right. ADC first item space. Are ADC items meant to have horrendous build paths, or is there another reason behind the BF Sword, Cloak, and Slingshot build paths for both Yuntal and Stormrazor? There are often many items in ADC has to recall and go back with less than 1,300 gold, so BF Sword feels horrible to die early, where it's meant to be a greed item component, is seen as intended first item purchases. Meanwhile, they could have a version that has much better build path from Pickaxe and Noon Quiver, where recalling does not end up feeling like being punished by the game. Okay, so two separate things. Number one, bad build paths mean that the item gets to be more powerful. The example that I give, I've talked about this a number of times on stream. Example I always give is Catalyst build path and Rod of Ages, right? When we added a Ruby Crystal to the Catalyst build path, we had to nerf Rod of Ages multiple times because the build path was so much better that suddenly Rod of Ages was a ubiquitous item that so many different mages were picking up, and it was very powerful in a lot of different mages. Just like the item itself wasn't more powerful, just the build path was easier, right? The build path was a little better because of Catalyst, right? So if we did decide, even just from an objective item power standpoint, if we did decide that we wanted to do Noon Quiver, Pickaxe, or whatever for Yuntal or Stormrazor, the items would be nerfed a lot. Like, I don't think people really like fully grasp like how much power there is in build paths. And so by making the build path worse, that is part of what lets those items be more powerful when they're completed, right? Especially Yuntal, and Stormrazor to a slightly lesser degree. So that's one thing. The other thing that I'll mention here is that AD carries have some of the best, I think, what I would consider to be like greed gameplay around basing, right? You have another person in your lane who can potentially hold waves for you or potentially push opponents away. You have, your support could potentially leave, and so there's a lot of interesting decisions about like when you base relative to your support, when your support bases, when the enemy support bases, when the enemy carry bases. The waves are more stable because there are two people in the lane, right? Like When it's a 1v1 lane, of course, it's much more likely that wave gets like blown up or gets frozen or whatever, right? Like there being two people in lane means the waves are more stable and more understandable. And because there's more likely to be someone there to defend a push or to break a freeze. Anyway, I don't need to get into all these details, but ultimately the actual answer here is like we generally believe that AD carries actually have the most compelling structure to their items for greed purchases, and that's one of the reasons why they're the main class that still has a really expensive component that's in their first items. And then simultaneously, I will say that we don't actually want AD carries getting all of their desired stats on their first item without a trade-off. And currently, the trade-off that we have for these two items is that they have rough build paths. And part of the power is that they get all the stats that they want, right? The goal here, right, and part of the reason for this is that we want attack speed purchases to feel good for AD carries. And so if we have these really effective first items that give all the stats that you want, it becomes pretty impossible for us to make items later in your builds that are actually satisfying for AD carries. And so we have to sort of figure out where that satisfaction gets to be. Is it on completing your first item or is it on your second item? Is it that you have the stat distribution solved on your second or your third item, right? We have to put that somewhere. And the Mythic, like one of the problems of the Mythic structure for AD carries was that when we gave them everything that they wanted on their first item, because they had, Mythic Kraken Slayer or Mythic Gale Force giving them all the stats that they want, we couldn't make other items that actually felt good for them at all because they already have everything that they need. It's like, okay, I guess I buy an Infinity Edge. Okay, I guess I buy an LDR. All right. None of my other items are interesting. None of my other items are compelling, right? Because we can't give you anything in that space that feels good. And so part of the reason why we can't give you everything without a trade-off for AD carries specifically is because AD carries are just like multiplier addicts, right? They're just going to buy whatever the most multiplicative stat is. And so by offering them some like attractive lopsided first items, we can then make their build paths different and interesting such that not every AD carry is just here is Metagolem crit item number 1. Here's Infinity Edge. Here is LDR. Here is Metagolem crit item number 2. Right? Like this is the problem with, like, for example, crit lifesteal Bloodthirster is that it slots into that build as the 4th slot every single time. And Yuntal has the danger of being the first slot item every time if Yuntal is tuned to be powerful and has a really effective build path, right? And so those are the risks that we're looking at. Is like we don't want every single crit AD carry to have the same exact build that is not interesting, that is not compelling and not satisfying, right? Those are the problems we're trying to address here. Why does Gnar Q boomerang only hit once? This is kind of an interesting one. So ultimately, I don't know the answer to this question. Gnar was made before my time working at Riot. You'd have to find August and ask him, next time he's streaming, maybe. So you can try and ask him about this. I'll give you some guesses, right? So here are my top guesses for why this is. Number 1, Mega Gnar Q is only going to hit once because it's just a rock that you lob, right? So this keeps the spells being more similar, so you don't have, completely different considerations on where your positioning is immediately after the Q in Mega Gnar versus Mini. It's just pick up the thing, which is like something that's well visualized, not something, and so you don't have to worry about that. However, I suspect the stronger reason is probably the Q has gameplay about picking it up, right? Like the post here was like talking about like all the other boomerang spells, right? Like REQ and auction Q and stuff like that hit on the way back. Those spells go back to the user, right? Whereas Gnar Q doesn't. Gnar Q already has a positional ask. It says pick up the boomerang, which is influenced by your movement, but it's asking you to perform a specific action, to be in a certain line to pick up the boomerang. And so it would be awkward if it simultaneously told you pick up the boomerang and also position for the boomerang to hit twice. I suspect that ultimately the reason here is largely about August wanted the pick up the boomerang gameplay and cared less about the hit twice gameplay. That would be my best guess. As to why it only hits once. But it could also be things related to like, hey, it needs to be, you want it to be more similar to Mega Gnar Q or something like that. I have no idea. Again, go ask August if you can find him. All right. Statikk Shiv has not really been buildable since Yuntal's came out. I understand historically this item has been difficult to balance. Currently, there aren't really any archetypes that want to build this item. Now, the ADC first item space is more compelling options. Could Shiv be looked at again? Preferably get crit chance back. Okay, so a couple of things here that are not true. This item is purchased, right? It is in fact, very powerful item for Senna AD carry, Akshan in soul lanes, and Quinn in soul lanes. It's actually a very good item for all of those champions as their first purchase. So it is not true that it's not buildable. An item being not purchased by like mainline hardcore AD carries, that's a different topic. But the item is for sure buildable. It is factually good on those champions, and there's a few AD carries that can buy the item, and it's not terrible on them. It's just not the worst thing. It's not the best thing they could be doing generally. I would say my perspective on this item is that we're pretty unwilling to accept AD carries trivializing wave clear on first item. I think that's pretty clearly true. We are not willing to say that like AD carries are allowed to just flash clear waves, where this causes a lot of problems for the structure of AD carry kits, where if we give them sufficiently powerful wave clear on first item, it causes a huge number of problems for some kits, like ignoring some of their intended gameplay, like say Zeri, for example, where it's like, yeah, you're supposed to need to set up W's and actually stand on the wave and Q and actually like be able to give your opponents some opportunities to interact with you. When she gets Shiv, a lot of that gameplay goes away, right? And so on and so forth, right? And they're not, these AD carries are not actually willing to pay the cost that's appropriate for clearing the wave, right? Like as an example, Quinn and Akshan are actually more willing to pay for wave clear distributed over a larger number of auto attacks than real AD carries are, which is why they're buying the current version of Shiv. Anyway, I do tend to agree that like this item could probably use a look, but I think that it getting crit and being a powerful first item for AD carries and having all three stats on it is like almost zero chance of that happening. It being a 3-stat crit item and being a good first item are probably mutually exclusive, for one. Like I was talking about earlier with the Yuntal and Stormrazor, part of the price in our current AD carry item structure, not saying we'd have to keep to this forever, but part of the cost of having 3-stat items in our current structure in order to make the item system satisfying is that you're not allowed to have all of this AD carry stats unless there is a really meaningful trade-off, which currently is the build path. And Shiv is actually an example of the passive itself is an extremely attractive, extremely powerful and desirable effect for your first item specifically, right? And so it having crit probably means that it doesn't have AS or it doesn't have AD. And I'm kind of skeptical we can make a compelling version of that item. And then when I think about like, okay, well, what about a Zeal version, right? Bring it back to Zeal. It's like, okay, well, no one buys that version. I think it's a tough space. I'm not saying it's unsolvable, and I wouldn't be surprised if at some point we wanted to take a look at this because obviously it's like, it's a high fantasy item, and I think it could be better than what it currently is. But I also think that I look at the current state and I say it's not the depths of the dungeon worst state an item has ever been in, right? People are buying it and it's good for them, right? Like it's good for a number of champions. And it's not like causing problems for those champions specifically. So I don't know. I think it's okay. It could be better for sure though. This is another one I could just quickly answer of like ability to set keybinds for different champions. This is very similar to the heal and shield power and tooltips. It's like, yeah, this is something we know would be awesome. It's just a question of when do we want to prioritize this? I think that this is something we were talking about doing recently in one of the dev videos. So if that's true, go look at the recent dev videos. I'm not really sure. But yeah, it's something that we know would be cool. It's been on a backlog for a long time. And then the final question here, doesn't look like we're going to make it quite to 2 hours on this video. But is there any room in the AD Assassin item space for a mana item with lethality? This is something that I talked about a lot when I was working on the initial prototypes for a lot of the items that I actually ended up shipping for this season, was like mana itemization and like which classes should or should not have access to mana itemization. The conclusion I came to was that it could be like maybe there's space here if we came up with the right passive. It's just coming up with good passives like that scale with mana or have mana on them, or like items that have mana on them and it makes sense for them is tough. I think that mana lethality is pretty narrow, but there is a clear space here, right? It would be like, lethality Varus, Jayce potentially, maybe a couple of other champions that like lethality and, run out of mana, maybe lethality Sivir type stuff. I think there might be a space for this, but it's the kind of thing where I look at it and I'm like, this just can't be a high priority for us. Like, it's the kind of thing where if we stumble into it, cool, that could be a good item. But it's the kind of thing where it's like, I just don't think we should prioritize making an item like this because it's not really necessary. It's a nice to have type of item. And it's a nice to have item that would not be particularly like broadly useful. It's like there's a few champions and a few off builds that could use it. Um, but not something I would consider to be super desirable for the item space, but something that could probably exist. Um, you know, could have space for this. So that's all the questions for today. All the ones I'm going to get through. As I mentioned, these questions were for, well, actually, I only mentioned this in my previous video. These questions were from my Discord. If you have a question that you'd like me, or a topic that you'd like me to talk about in a future video, then feel free to join my Discord, which will be, I'll have a link to it in the description again. Yeah, I'll pick out the questions, especially the ones that are highly upvoted by people that people want to hear about, and throw them into a video. But yeah, thanks for watching Q&A number 2. I'm going to go get some lunch and have a good day, everybody. See ya.